Hello, hello. Welcome once again to our last Design Talks, virtual Design Talks event of the year. I I still don't know if saying virtual is a necessity. Most of the things are virtual now, so is it just most of you get it. But I'm really excited to once again host our friends from Fable. Uh, for those of you who might be tuning in for one of these the whole series that we did around accessibility and design. If you're attending this for the first time, so Fable has been our incredible community partner for the last 3 months. And we have some incredible speakers once again joining us, as well as some familiar faces. So today, we're talking all about the intersection of design and research in accessibility. So it's going to be a pretty frank and free flowing conversation between Sam, again, a familiar face. We've hosted a couple of events with Sam. He's an accessibility evangelist at Fable. And also, we have joining in today Kaitlyn. So, Kaitlyn is one of Fable's longest serving accessibility researchers. And we'll be covering the ways that accessibility, design, and research must work together in order to create truly accessible designs. So it'll involve talking about the pitfalls of involving accessibility research a little too late in the design process, a pain point that I'm sure resonates with many of us, as well as the importance of inclusive design in creating products that work for everyone. So we've been touching on parts of this conversation in the previous events, and today seems like a perfect way to kind of go towards the peak of this conversation and also end this whole series that we've been doing it again with our incredible friends at Fable. So we'll get to know a little bit about our two speakers as well as the conversation. So let's get started. I'll bring them on stage. Hello, hello.
Hey,
Hi.
great to be here this morning or possibly afternoon, depending on whereabouts everyone is again. All right, so for those of you who recognize me, I'm probably becoming a familiar face. We've done a couple of events together in the past. I'm Sam Prue, the accessibility evangelist here at Fable, which means I get to spend a lot of time talking to events, conferences, organizations about the importance of accessibility, about why it's so critical, and about the reasons that we should be thinking about accessibility early and that we should be involving the voices of people with disabilities into the product design and development process. And I've presented on a number of different topics around that over the past few months with the great community here at DesignX. And for the final event of the year, I really wanted to have a conversation with someone who's actually been doing it. Because as a person with a disability, it can be very easy for me to say, well, this is what you should do, and how come nothing works, and how come nobody's doing it? But I'm here today with Kaitlyn, who's one of my colleagues here at Fable. Why don't you start off by talking about a little bit about you, a little bit about who you are, and then kind of what you've been doing at Fable as one of our accessibility researchers.
Yeah, for sure. I am Kaitlyn. I'm a UX researcher, which is not as cool of a title as an accessibility evangelist. We'll leave that be. I have been working with Fable for a year now, working on how to understand fundamentally what people's research goals are and how that intersects with accessibility and how we can meet those halfway and try to find a balance of how to make one things more accessible but also very enjoyable for people with accessibility needs.
Absolutely. I love that you sort of triggered on that. It goes beyond just sort of usable and accessible, but towards enjoyable. And that's one of the things that I always talk about, sort of going beyond compliance a little bit there. By the way, as usual, this is an interactive kind of event and conversation. Preet will be helping us bring some of your questions on stage. So if you do have any questions that are burning and that you'd love to ask, absolutely put them in the chat of whatever platform you happen to be on. So you've been working at Fable. You've been doing this for some time now. How did you get into kind of UX and accessibility? What was your exposure before Fable, and how did you get started and get to where you are now?
Yeah, it's probably been a long process and a little bit of an atypical one. So I don't have a formal background in accessibility, but I do have lived experience in it. My mother is legally blind. She's an avid user of Screen Mag, and it's something that I've been close up and personal for a number of years now on kind of what her personal experience like. So this is the first time I've got an opportunity to kind of merge what my day-to-day experience with her has been, not to co-opt what her story is, but what I can see that she faces in her day-to-day struggles, and get to apply that in a professional and kind of meaningful way. So it's been a really great journey so far.
Absolutely. I mean, you obviously don't want to co-opt her story and are very careful about that. But I think as the daughter of somebody who lives with who has a visual disability, who uses screen magnification, you have interesting lived experience of your own that's probably very different perhaps from say mine or from the actual person who lives with a disability. And like,
Hmm.
is that lived experience what brought you into like, oh, I have to make the world better because I'm seeing my mother's frustrations or her limitations? Or was it you just grew up with your mother and that was who she was and it was normal and you never really felt that? I'm sort of curious.
Yeah, I've actually thought a lot about this question and I don't have a great answer. I think for the first little bit, it's one of those things as you're growing up that you never really realize that things are different, that you're different, or that your experience is different. And it's kind of the accumulation over time. All those little things that you notice seem to be a little bit harder or take a little bit longer or just don't seem to work, that kind of add up over time to this overall kind of cumulative experience, that I think starts getting frustrating. I think this is something that anybody who has kind of points of exclusion in life kind of
Hmm.
sees those build up over time, and then you want to make a meaningful change towards it. But it's not one thing that's a tipping point, it's just the weight of all of them together.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's not like one moment where you suddenly realize, oh my goodness, but it just adds up.
Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And in different ways across life. Like I remember my mom never really being able to enjoy me playing soccer. That was something that she always really felt like she missed out on. And I think that was something that really hurt me. But then over time, you notice how it affects her. And I think this was also a thing, is like you mature, you become a teenager, you become an adult, and you kind of have those things where you see your parent as a human being and not just a parent anymore, and you understand their struggles. I have a lot of friends who are mothers and they only understand their problems that their mothers have once they become a mother. I think working at Fable has also given me the opportunity to understand and empathize in that way a lot stronger than I otherwise would have been able to.
Yeah, Preet, I think you wanted to chime in.
Yeah, yeah, no, like I've always felt the and this is around accessibility. I had similar experiences, growing up in India and being exposed to other kind of challenges. And I always noticed that once you get exposed to the challenges, the passion towards working to help solve them in any manner just magnifies. So I keep thinking, about this from an accessibility lens. Often, when you are again pitching projects, you are highlighting the importance of accessibility in a larger team. How can you help others also develop, similar sense of empathy? Which, of course, the how Kaitlyn would feel, of course, is as she said, is a sum of all those experiences, and it's not just one instance. So are there experiences or ways you think we can help increase the empathy levels when we are part of a larger team and bringing up the conversations, especially in organizations that are still quite far from this discussion?
Yeah, I think Sam's also a great person to answer this, but I think there's at the base level is a kind of a curiosity of kind of understanding at a human level what people experience and how that impacts them. I think that's a larger conversation in society about social impact, but there's a wealth of resources online, whether they're blogs or on Twitter or Reddit, of what that impact feels like, from a very human and from a very storytelling kind of point of view. And I think sometimes we get caught up in research of what are the completion rates, what are the metrics, and we forget what is the impact that that has on someone on a day-to-day level. If you're someone who statistically people with disabilities are very underemployed, and why is that? What are the tools that we are using, and what is the greater resource from that? If, for example, Outlook was inaccessible and that was the main point of email that you use, you wouldn't be able to do your job. You wouldn't be able to make a living. There's these wider connections of, I think we need to get past of just what a component does and what the greater meaning of that is. But Sam, I know you're more of the guru online when it comes to blogs and resources. Do you have any suggestions?
Yeah. So first of all, I think just to get on the record, I know you weren't saying it, but I do want to put on the record that Outlook is very accessible. It's great.
I know.
I just didn't want someone to like take that quote and run with it. But I think it's about the voices of people. We've recently published an article on the Fable website about the accessibility of online events, and it was really important to me to include a lot of data, but we also want to include the quotes and the lived experiences that come out from people with disabilities, because it's stories that bring things alive. And I think the reason we do a lot of video-based qualitative research here at Fable is because it's that video and that interaction with people with disabilities that brings the thing alive for people. Although, on the other hand, to bring the focus back to you, Kaitlyn, one thing I do wonder, before we sort of move on from this topic, is it easier for you as a person who is fully aware of the lived experience because of your background, but you're one step away? I know, speaking from my personal experience, when a product doesn't work, there can sometimes be a lot of emotion and a lot of frustration and a lot of like, why doesn't this work? I just need it to work. Whereas you have that one step removed. Does it make it easier for you to do what you do?
Great question, Sam. I think it depends. Sometimes I think it can get a little frustrating and a little exhausting, to be sure, where you have to kind of take a moment and take a breath and kind of think about the bigger picture of maybe this thing isn't working the way it's intended to right now, but at least people are trying. That's a great point and a great starting point. And I think sometimes we get caught up in seeing the forest, but not the leaves within it, and all the little things that make up to get to those points. So on a day to day, sometimes it can be frustrating, but the bigger picture and part of my job is to step back and be like, how do we get through this entire forest in a more meaningful way and an impactful way? And that's by all these little steps along the way.
How do you find, because you do a lot of what you do involves researching with people with disabilities? Do you find that you get a lot of that emotion and that frustration that you have to process, or do you find that people with disabilities are pretty open and pretty good at like not sort of bringing the emotion and the frustration into the research that you're conducting?
I think one of the key differences between kind of UX research and accessibility research is that people with disabilities actually tend to underplay their experience in a way that they expect things not to work. So they're often more likely to blame themselves when something isn't working. Like, oh, I haven't been on this website before, it's my fault, or just a lot of reasons that as a researcher, you kind of have to parse through and be like, no, it's valid that you can do this and it's meaningful and it's also not your fault. So you spend a lot more time in those experiences and those exchanges of people's expectations tend to be far lower because accessibility is something that people a lot of times haven't thought of in the user experience, and people with disabilities often live that from a day to day. So like you said earlier, Sam, just base level compliance is something that people are happy with, but do you experience joy from that as well, is something that often when we're doing research with people with disabilities, they're never asked. Like, did you love this experience? Did you enjoy it? What was your favorite part?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, sort of, as we dig into talking about research and the aspects of it and the experiences of it. This is Design X, and we've got a very design heavy community. So based on the research you've conducted and the experiences that you've had, what are some aspects of accessibility that designers should be thinking about before they even before they even put pen to paper and start with their designs?
I think you need to think about kind of what your overall arch of what you're trying to do and kind of include people with different perspectives and people from disabilities from the visioning stage. I'll give you an example of when this has gone wrong. So when we've done research, we actually had a really great opportunity to run research on kind of a messaging app and adding alt text to an image when you're sending it. So when we were doing that, everyone was able to do it. It was perfectly accessible. But one of the key issues was that you could actually only add alt text after you had sent the image, not before, not in the messaging format. So it made accessibility part of an afterthought. But if you were to ask someone or just kind of vision of what should accessibility be, at a visioning stage instead of at a prototype stage or at a product stage, that probably would have been caught. So thinking about what are your goals and what are the easier ways to get there, not easiest ways, but ways to include different perspectives, I think is really important. And then also thinking about how do you test these in like a meaningful way. Some people might not know this, but Figma prototypes are actually accessible for screen reader users. So you can't test prototypes with screen readers. So you have to find out other ways of doing that. And a lot of that could be done at a visioning stage of what is your expectations for being able to do this design process or being able to use this product. And being less attached to an actual product or design at that stage. I think that might have not answered your question, but I'll go with it.
No, I think it was a good answer.
Yeah.
Questions are jumping off points. Pretty, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, I think what Kaitlyn just said about the starting from the visioning stage just reminded me of a gap I created or I made when I was working with Sam on Remote Design Week. So, we've been doing this conference. It was our second year, but we've been pretty much using the same schedule template on the website for I think the last 3-4 conferences we've done. But we've not in the past had a speaker with accessibility needs, and we realized this time that our schedule was like terribly designed from an accessibility point, because we had Sam as a speaker, and when Sam went through it, and of course he was in the most polite, kind manner tried to highlight that it was really hard to even navigate through the schedule point. So and again, I think in the end we went with a very kind of hacky route of putting together a Google Sheet version, that was accessible. But again, had we thought about it in the beginning, had we even got that feedback early on, if we had made the effort to test it, those kind of gaps could have been caught. So yeah, just wanted to plus to what you said. Um, and on the point of Figma prototypes, did you? I didn't get that. Were you saying they are accessible through a screen reader, or are they not?
They aren't. No, but
They are not. Okay.
no, you can test it with other types of assistive technologies, but not with screen readers. So that's something that we actually end up in the research stage when people come with prototypes and they were like, we'd love to test this. And we're like, we can't. There's ways to kind of get around it and do different things, but it's one of those things that, again, in multiple stage of the design process, thinking about kind of what the intent of your design is and how to test it in different ways. And a great way is honestly to, if you can't test it in a prototype stage, including it at a more visioning or ideation stage.
Right.
I've doing something that I told Preet I wasn't going to do, but I'm doing it because I'm so fascinated. We have a couple of good audience questions to pull in. I think is of interest to the community, and one that I think is of interest just to me, talking to a researcher here. We have a question from Aditi. I assume that's how you pronounce that. And they asked, do you think that the accessibility tools being used today, like TalkBack, have high usability? And my initial answer to that is, well, yeah, I use them every day. I think they're very usable. But of course, I'm a very bad person to answer that question because I'm an expert and I use them every day. So, Kaitlyn, I wonder, like, what do you think? Where are we when it comes to assistive technology? Have we gotten to a state where it's easy to use and works well from your perspective as a researcher, rather than my perspective as an expert who's going to say, yeah, I know how to do this. It's great.
The I'm gonna kind of and say it depends. um, it depends on how you're using it and what the intent of it is. I mean, again, I think we get focused on, like, can you complete things? And if that is the point of that tool, then yeah, talkback works great in that realm of it completes things the way that you expect. But what is kind of the dream state that we're trying to get to, and what does that look like? And I think we need a lot more work on imagining what those dream states for people with disabilities are, and how they can achieve it. And it's probably in different ways than we imagine.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Another interesting question is, my screenreader is saying Ciara, but I'm going to guess that it's supposed to be Kiara, who asks, how do you communicate back with users after research sessions are over, if at all? I ask because we ask for feedback of an underrepresented group of individuals and gather their lived experiences, but then they are traditionally left out of the rest of the process.
This is an interesting one. So again, it depends. If we're doing kind of more iterative research and we're kind of coming back around on things, it's actually great to use users repeatedly, but also different, not at the same time. What I mean by that is, it's great when people come back, and sometimes we have clients and we use the same testers for each thing, and they appreciate seeing kind of all those little changes over time, and it actually gives them really hope. One of the questions I ask at the end of a design process is, how do you feel about this in one word? And often people say hopeful or thankful because they see these small improvements. It depends also on what your needs are. I think Fable is bound by a little bit more privacy, so we can't always tell people after the fact what's going on. But I think in some kind of greater research studies, it's a great opportunity to be like, this is what we did, look at what the impact has been, because it's great for users, but it's also great to see designers, to see how thankful people are and what people say about their design. I think sometimes designers, the biggest impact I've seen is when they see those videos or they see quotes, and you can get those in multiple stages. And I would encourage people, especially if you don't have privacy concerns, to reach back out and ask people what they think about it and how those things have changed.
Wow, brilliant professional on your end. Looking at my notes, what an amazing segue into the next question, that I wanted to ask and that I had here, which is, in a lot of organizations, there's kind of, people are siloed. There's the design team and there's the research team, and that can work for a lot of UX research. But I think in accessibility research, that might be a little bit different. So why is it so important that designers and accessibility researchers work more closely together?
I think to start off, to kind of build that base of foundational knowledge, like I was saying about a Figma prototype, if you don't kind of have that consultation, that initial conversation of what you're trying to do and how you could test it, you might get many months down the road and then realize you actually can't do it, or that this isn't kind of a best case in design and inclusive design principles. So it's a really great kind of way of building capacity across a design team, and also just a base level of understanding and empathy to understand what are some common accessibility issues, and like how can you run in and avoid them as best you can, and being more aware of them so they're in the back of your head as you're doing the design process. So you really want to build up, I think, Sam, you would agree, good, accessible, and inclusive design doesn't just live with an accessibility researcher or a design team. It's best when you build capacity across a lot of different organizations in product, in development, in QA. There's great opportunities to build that capacity, but it starts from just having conversations.
Absolutely, it's conversations and inclusion that are so important, and it's hard to be inclusive if everybody's siloed off into their own own kind of departments. Real quick audience question from Priscilla. What do you recommend for testing with screen readers for prototypes? Perhaps building quickly on Webflow and having a staging site? Yep, that's an excellent technique. Or putting together a prototype in a Word document or an Excel spreadsheet, something like that would also be great. If that's of interest, I do have kind of more information about that I could perhaps go into in a later DesignX event. While we're doing the audience questions, Preet, is there anything that I've missed that you think we should bring on?
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. I would say anything
Perfect.
missed. I think the one question that for me as a designer, as I'm listening to Kaitlyn, and I'm pretty sure everyone's like just nodding. They're like, "Yep, yeah, makes sense." And the one area where we get stuck is the how part. So it's like, increase capacity, bring accessibility researchers. It's like, yes, so important for those of us who might not be in the leadership roles that are defining those budgets and doing those things. It's like, how do I, as a designer, I'm midway working on a product that maybe is out there, maybe it's not. What like how do I move towards what just the stage that Kaitlyn described?
Yeah, the how is always the hardest part, and that's very fair. And it'll take different paths to get there. I think depending on how you utilize user research, like again, that's a very important stage, but I think building your own capacity, like we talked about at the beginning of the hour, and kind of those thought leaderships of what the best cases of inclusive design are. I know not everybody has access to people with disabilities, so sometimes it's really hard to show a prototype or a build and get feedback. Sometimes that is a bit tricky, but there are a lot of tools out there, and there's also a lot of resources out there, and there's a growing amount of resources that you can use to kind of build that capacity within yourself and then build it across a team. And there's also a great business case for why to do that as well, of like what the reach is for users, and to go to leadership and have those conversations of why it's impactful.
Absolutely. I think another thing that I frequently recommend and say to folks whose companies are in the early stages that can be an early, easier lift perhaps, is make sure that there are ways that are accessible to contact support and that there is a place that your support staff knows accessibility feedback is going. Because you have either people who are your users who have disabilities or who want to be and can't. And if you're not hearing from them, it's not because they don't exist. It's because either the ways you have to get in touch with you are inaccessible, or because the people who are hearing from those folks don't know where to file the feedback and don't know where to put it. And so, if you can get a way to get that feedback collected in an accessible manner and get it put somewhere, it can help you make the business case as well. I think is something that would be really a helpful way to start that maybe is not the huge lift of, okay, let's do 30% of our research with people with disabilities.
Right. That's such a good point, especially when I think when it's an early stage product, then you also don't have so much design debt to go back into and redesign everything. And not to completely segue from the conversation, but just I'm curious about, from the clients that you've worked with and the companies or products that Fable has worked on and both of you have worked on, have you seen any patterns when you're working with larger teams and larger products? Is it a complete, like, you have to tear down and kind of redesign from the scratch? Is there a way that you just you go straight to the design system and you're like, let's make that accessible, the components and everything, the platform becomes more accessible? Have there been any kind of patterns you've seen over the different companies you've worked with?
I think it depends on the customer and what we're talking about, but I think
Mm.
it also, although I don't want to lean on having a base level compliance, people need to be able to actually use the product itself. So I think a lot of the times we are actually surprised when we want to find out kind of what a user journey is or a flow and how that goes about, but people can't even get through the login page. So that's kind of a critical failure, of you have kind of like a
Yeah.
CAPTCHA that people can't use. And those are things that you want to
Right.
look out for at the very beginning, that you'd be surprised how many people run into those. of these like fundamental things that make it completely inaccessible that you won't even get meaningful feedback from. And to start there as kind of what are these very high priority issues that are completely blocking you getting any sort of usable research, and then going from there and kind of picking off the fruit one by one of what makes a meaningful change, what does your design team have capacity to change right now, what could be run in a sprint down the line. I think you also have to let go of the idea that you're going to be able to fix everything at once. Design is a process, and it's kind of continually improving it for all users and taking it one step at a time.
Absolutely. And one thing that I frequently say to folks is that there is this true fact that automated testing can only detect 30% of accessibility problems. But it is still of great value, and automated testing and research should go hand in hand, because every issue that you can test with an automated test is now an issue that you are not stressing out research participants with. And so there's sort of this idea that, like, oh, if it's easy to detect and easy to fix, it must be low impact. And that's not true at all. I frequently advise folks, like, fix what you can, because everything that you fix that you catch in automated testing will now make your manual testing of greater value and give you better results.
For sure.
So that kind of brings us nicely into the next question. We're talking a lot about accessibility research and how to do it, and what are some patterns. And so, I mean, when should ideally accessibility research start? When do you, as a designer, if you have access to an accessibility researcher or you're doing the research yourself, when do you pull them in? When do you get them involved? When do you start the accessibility research process?
All the time. So you want to be doing kind of in that constant process of design cycle, like you're always going back and doing a constant evaluation. And that's also a really good opportunity to be tapping people with accessibility research. So building that foundational knowledge, doing the visioning stage, understanding what is the user goal, what are the points of exclusion we are predicting to happen, how do we test for those points of inclusion, how do we test for a prototype, how do we test with a live build, what are the results of those, and then kind of going back around in that design cycle. Good design is based off of those fundamental ideas of that ideation process and a constant reiteration of that. And that's also what good accessibility research is. It's not a one and done, it's a constant rethinking of that. And that also takes time, but there's ways to do that in a meaningful way that don't have to be a big lift. I think at the beginning, it can kind of be a little bit intimidating of feeling like you're asking the wrong questions, or you're feeling like you're being a little bit intrusive on the questions that you're asking. But I think when you talk to anybody who really wants a change and an impact, they're happy to share those points. They're happy to explain what the impact is to them, and not to be afraid of those conversations and really lean into them in multiple places in the design process, and seeing where that takes you, which is also a little bit scary, but I think also in the end very meaningful.
Absolutely. And you've been doing this for some time now. I'm sure you have seen places where that doesn't happen, where the accessibility research is brought in late and the designs are set and the things have been developed, and now it's time to do accessibility research near the end. What are some of the pitfalls? What are some of the problems that causes?
Yeah, sometimes at that stage, you're basing things just on kind of base level. Does this component work? Is there a completion rate? And you're kind of missing the boat on stuff. Like often, sometimes you realize after the fact, kind of when you're signifying a change in state in kind of UX, often colors are used, and that's the only way to know that there's a change of state. But for a screen reader, that's actually not meaningful. You can't tell that there has been a change of state based on color from something going from green to red. And you don't have time to make those changes. You can't make them because it's going to have to go back. You're going to have to do a lot with the developers. But you just won't. You'll run out of time. So I think the shortfall of that is you won't be able to make the changes that you want to. They won't be impactful, or you'll just kind of have to ignore them for the next sprint because they're things that you didn't predict that would come up in that point of view. So I would encourage people to really, at least, I know it's a kind of a dream state to have accessibility research at every point, but it shouldn't be the last point. But far from that, you should have at least a few points of having those conversations to ensure that you're not running into the lack of time or lack of capacity.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the oh, we didn't realize major changes were needed, and so we didn't put it in the deadline and in the timeline. Um, hey, we're getting a whole lot of really great audience questions, and that I love, and they're coming in fast enough that I
Mhm.
lost track of them. So I'm going to turn it over to Preet to bring in some of your questions.
Yeah, absolutely. There are quite a few questions coming in. One in particular that was really interesting was from Drew, which was about how can designers with disabilities get hired when competing with designers without disabilities with the barriers of the application process. And again, I know we are talking more about the products, more on the process part, and this kind of the question kind of flips it more towards people doing the work with the craft. So is that something, Kaitlyn, that um, you've experienced in the process of working at Fable in the community? Something you could
Yeah,
speak to?
I actually think this is a really important question because it speaks to who's making those changes and ultimately who the designer is. And I think that's
Mm.
really impactful. Having people with disabilities being the designers is a great end goal to be shooting for. And I really love this question.
Mhm.
I think often in life, people need to leverage what makes them unique. And you, as a designer, have a unique point of view that probably no one else can offer, and you should
Yeah.
lead with that. Don't be afraid of saying that you have a disability and why it actually makes you a better designer, and explain exactly why. It's actually a great thing to have a person with disability on your design team because you will be able to catch some of these fundamental things that you might not in the design process because someone will be able to put up a flag and say like, hey, this is very impactful. This happens all the time outside of disabilities, just across the board of when you have just kind of a majority of types of people making a decision and the impact that can have both on design but in the world when you don't have multiple voices. So I think if you are trying to get hired, it's instead of seeing it as a weakness, it's actually one of your greatest strengths, and go forward with that in a very meaningful way.
Absolutely. I would love to see more designers who are people with disabilities, not only who are in the industry, but who are outspoken about their identity and who are leveraging that identity with pride. Because I think there's this sort of, oh well, we should try to compete. We shouldn't disclose our disability when we try to get hired, but no, it's an asset that we have, and
Mm.
there is no shame associated with any of your identity, and thus not only no need to keep it quiet or to not disclose it or to keep it secret, but there are advantages in disclosing it. That's sort of the only thing I would add there.
Really beautifully said. Uh, we have one more question, which is kind of a little more tactical, Caitlin, to the things you just spoke on. So we have someone asking that when you are presenting, these learnings, findings from the user research sessions to stakeholders in a presentation format. So other than video clips or quotes and text to maintain tester confidentiality, are there other ways to make the session interactions kind of more impactful or bring them to life?
Yeah, I think when you kind of think about the bigger picture of what a user journey is and kind of the intent of the product and what the ultimate failing of that product is. Again, we talked about how Outlook actually is quite accessible, so I'm not going to throw them under the bus, but could you imagine if it wasn't and what that would mean? Is it extra time that causes? Is it means that somebody can't do their job? Does it mean that you can't talk to your family if you're using chat function? There's a lot of ways of, I think sometimes people don't understand kind of like what a completion rate is or a pain point or frustration is, but kind of painting a picture of in a meaningful way of what would that mean in your day-to-day life? What would that mean a year down the road? how do you kind of create a user journey and a user story and add those up in a meaningful way to kind of tell that story to get people to really understand the impacts of what an inaccessible product is.
There's a thing that comes up here that I think some folks are divided on, and that I think I have my opinion on. Well, I don't think I know I have my opinion on, but I'd love to hear from you as a researcher. Do you ever find yourself just launching accessibility, accessive technology like a screen reader on your own computer and using it yourself in order to try and simulate that experience? And like, are there advantages to it, and what are the pitfalls there?
Yeah, this is hotly debated. Okay.
That's why you're answering it, not me. No, I'm
I
kidding.
know, I know. Um, my answer is yes, I do. At times, I especially do it on mobile, and I'll use voiceover on my mobile but I use it for quick checks. I kind of do it as almost a QA of when I'm in an interview and something not behaving the way I would expect it, or a user is running into issues and maybe we're running out of time, maybe there's other reasons, and I'll go back and see if I can kind of reproduce it. I usually do that on a very kind of tactical component level. The reason why this is kind of hotly debated is because people's AT, when it takes a long time to learn, so there can be kind of a lot of user errors if you're not a regular user of that AT, and it's hard to kind of know what's going on there. It's also kind of a little bit dicey in the way that if you just had everybody kind of downloading voiceover and not consulting people with disabilities because they're just using the assistive technology themselves, there's a lot of reasons why or why not to. Personally, I do it for quick checks just to kind of as a validation once you've already found a problem. That's kind of my personal area where I feel comfortable, where a problem has already been showed up on a video or in an interview or in a compatibility test, and I'm going in and validating results. But I would never just run into it. But it is a good way to kind of base level understand how people are running into issues with your products. I wouldn't rely on it completely, but if you're kind of interested and curious about how assistive technologies work, it's quite easy on your Android or your iOS just to kind of switch over and see what does that impact like.
Absolutely. I think that the sort of key sum up there is it can be a great way to build a little bit of understanding and empathy, but don't
Mm.
assume that as someone who picked up the thing for the first time today, you're having the same experience with it that I am. I guess would be the key way to sum that up.
Yeah,
Totally.
I was curious about why it's hotly debated. So thank you for sharing that part. Yeah, and I hope even the component level tooling space can have more of these tools, because again, when I was working with Sam, we went through, even just to test our own site, we went through some HTML. I'm blanking on name of the tools, but they just tell you the structure of your tags and everything. And even that was super helpful for me to know if I had, put the H1 tags in the right place for the right information, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, I know we're sort of coming up on the end of this one, but I wanted to sort of ask a couple of questions of Kaitlyn to close out the conversation that we're having today. As much as we would like to have this conversation for another hour, so many companies are as we have heard in some of these questions, are just starting the journey of inclusive design and accessibility, and I sort of commented on like some ways that you can maybe get buy-in. But if you've got the buy-in and you're all saying, okay, this is something that we know that we should do, what is the best place to start? What are the best things to do first? The best ways to start if you've never done this before and now you're committed to, okay, this is something I should do.
Yeah, I think there's so many ways to answer this question. There's a lot of courses and kind of understanding inclusive design principles of ways to go about that. There's also I think a lot of the time we just as designers go for the pursuit of perfection and really want to get it right all of the time and kind of hit it out of the park. And to start with like little steps of minor changes that you can make, check the color contrast of what you're designing, see how that goes, make changes to that, see what the impact is, continue, continue, continue. There's a lot of ways to go about this, but I think at the base level is just a widespread education across your team, and then actually trying it out. Sometimes you see people educate themselves and do a lot of work and then be afraid to actually do the work themselves on the design, and to just, yeah, let go of some ego, try to make those changes, see what happens. Maybe it'll work better, maybe it won't, and that's okay. But because you're ultimately your intent to do better, so to not be afraid of how that's going to go, and then just constantly work on that process.
Absolutely. And you are an accessibility researcher and a UX researcher and incredibly great at everything that you do. But unfortunately, not all designers have access to someone like you, to somebody who is trained in UX research, to somebody who has worked with people with disabilities before, or even to someone who has access to people with disabilities. So, what are some things designers can do to create more accessible products, even if they have to do the research themselves or they have to figure this out themselves? What are some tips and tricks you can offer sort of designers who maybe don't quite have the resources yet but want to start making improvements?
They should probably follow Sam on Twitter first off, because he's actually really great. I'm not on Twitter, but he has excellent resources. I think from there, I think there's a lot of the idea that design can't do research, and there's no reason that you can't. Some of the best designers that I've worked with over the last year are doing their own research, or at least sitting in on research. So I think if you don't have access to people with disabilities, going back over what we talked about, using some tools, kind of playing around with some accessibility settings on your phone and understanding what that experience is like, following some thought leadership like Sam and seeing where that takes you. Just generally being curious and building an empathy within yourself of what is the greater impact, and understanding that story. There's a lot of ways to go about it. I don't, there's a one all approach, but there's a lot of different ways to do that. There's so many free courses online of what this looks like on inclusive design principles, and starting from there, and then just building it up, and then just constantly putting in the effort and the work to educate yourself and then build that capacity within yourself.
Absolutely, and as we sort of move towards a close, I'll highlight an audience message that we just got that I think really covers something that I say a lot, and that I think is a great sort of note to close on, from Tyreek, I'm going to guess. Who said, I'd like to suggest that accessibility can be further expanded beyond people who are currently able, and it can be spread to people who don't have access to the internet, people who don't know how to read, and even more. And that is one of the key reasons why we call it inclusive design. Because when we talk about accessibility, we really can underestimate the people who need it, and we can think about accessibility as something that just benefits this tiny corner of people. It's really about seniors and children and people who have difficulty reading and people who English is their third or fourth language, which is the experience of a lot of people outside of North America. I certainly only speak one language, but I recognize that is not the norm throughout the world. And so yeah, that's it. It's about inclusive design, and there's a great quote that I heard recently in an accessibility conference that I was attending, which is that if you design for the edges, you get the middle for free. And so if we think about accessibility and we bring beyond that, I think you agree with that, right, Kaitlyn?
Yeah, I do. I think, yeah, honestly, thinking about what those edge cases are and what are the extremes and like those extreme points of exclusion, and designing for those is a great way of doing kind of a catch-all. And it's also a great way of, when you're building up an accessibility like design practice, of kind of being able to do these in kind of a more efficient way, both in terms of budget and in time, of getting those edge cases and seeing what the impact on those users are. And it's going to have tangible effects across all of your user base.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey, this has been a great, another great event, a great conversation. I wish it was longer,
Absolutely.
but I always love these Design X events and love being here. But it's coming up on 12:25, so I'm gonna turn it over to Preet to close us off.
Yeah, no, once again, big thanks to both of you. A lot of appreciation for you in our chat as well. As always, it's been an incredible event, incredible conversation. Kaitlyn, also, thank you so much for joining us. I hope not for the last time. You definitely joined for the first time, and we continue to host both of you. I think getting also the perspectives, as you know, speaking from these different domains is also incredibly important. So even though we are talking about accessibility, but you know, hearing from the researcher's lens, we've heard, of course, you know, Sam has always shared a lot also from quite a few different lenses. So hopefully, you know, we can keep educating our community and ourselves with these conversations. So thank you so much once again. Really appreciate it. We're going to share the resources. Some I already shared the links, but there is also,
Perfect.
for those of you who are in our Slack group on DesignX, there is a topic accessibility channel. Sam has shared many resources there in the past. Once again, hop in there. If there are new resources, we'll definitely continue to share those and help elevate, you know, our collective learning in the community around accessibility and inclusive design.
Absolutely. Both of these things are processes, and process involves conversation. So let's keep it going.
Totally.
Absolutely. Thank you so much to both of you.
Thanks all.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.